Minister Billström, thank you so much for talking to DW. Today, we have the Ukrainians fighting inside Russian territory. Is it the perspective in Sweden that this will bring the end of this war closer?
I think, and we should see it from that point of view, that everything that can hamper Russia's ability to do Ukrainians harm is a good thing. After all, it was Russia's illegal aggression against Ukraine that started this war, not Ukrainians attacking Russia. And that shouldn't be forgotten. What Russia is doing is in clear violation of every aspect of international law, and Russia will be held to account for this, all the way up even to its political leadership for what the crimes that it has committed within Ukraine. And the re-establishment of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty is paramount as we see it from the point of Sweden. Otherwise, we will see institutions like the United Nations, like the international rules-based order that we all have fought so hard for, Sweden, countries like Nigeria, countries in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America, that will all be called into question. Because if one big country can sit on another country and say, hey, might is right, I do what I want, I carve out a piece of your land and call it my own, where will that lead us? And Sweden, who is in favor of the multilateral system that was established after the Second World War and is against the re-establishment of imperialism, which Russia wants to do, because Russia wants to recreate its old empire at the expense of other countries, beginning with Ukraine. And we have to put a stop to that. And this is the policy of the Swedish government and of the Swedish people, where I have to say 90% are in favor of us continuing to support Ukraine, the highest figure in the entire European Union.
Is it the view then in Sweden that that continued support for Ukraine should include removing the restrictions for how Ukraine uses the weapons that have been donated by Western allies?
Well, actually, I would be very clear. We have never put any restrictions on the weapons that we have delivered to Ukraine. And we do not intend to do it now. And Ukraine has put those weapons to good use. And one very good example of this is what's been going on in the Black Sea. At the outbreak of the war, Russia imposed a war on the trade with grain out from Ukraine, which nearly caused world famine, especially in Africa. And thanks to the weapon deliveries, Ukraine has now been able to not only drive back the Russian naval forces, it has also been able to continue the deliverance of grain to the amount of 2,200 ships leaving Ukrainian ports with 63 million tons of grain. That is actually even not just bringing Ukraine back to the levels of export prior to the war, but prior to the war. They are now on higher figures. And this is something which we should not forget, that this is a major victory for Ukraine against Russia, but it is also a victory for poor people in the world over Russia, which started this war without any regards of the consequences for people who were to suffer from lack of food.
Minister, in Europe, Russia is the enemy, so to say. Here on the continent, Russia is a partner of choice, particularly when it pertains to military cooperation. Are you concerned about Russia's growing influence in the Sahel here in West Africa as well?
Well, first of all, I think that there are some misunderstandings. Russia is not the old Soviet Union, of which, by the way, Ukraine was a part. We shouldn't forget that from a historical point of view. Russia is now something completely different. Russia is a neo-imperialistic state who has no regards for the international system that we established after 1945 and who wants to recreate its empire on the expense of other countries. And that also means Africa. Now when we see Russian mercenaries acting in various countries in the neighborhood, what are the real aims of those groups? Is it to preserve democracy? Is it to give the people of those countries rights and liberties? Of course not. It is the old imperial way. You want the natural resources of those countries to be brought under your control. And so, yes, we are very concerned about the activities, and so are many other democratically elected leaders in West Africa. We perceive Africa as an important partner in the fight against poverty and for democracy and liberal rights, where Sweden and the other Nordic countries have been steadfast allies all the way from anti-colonialism and the fight against apartheid on to modern times where we live today. And yes, we are concerned by countries who are trying to impose imperial ways once again in the world, and we should all be.
Minister, there are people in countries like Niger, for example, who will today look at their lives and say, well, what difference did it make when Western countries were our allies? Insecurity was rising, the economic conditions were no better. It doesn't appear that being allied with the West, countries like France, has made these people's lives any better off.
Well, one could perhaps also ask them, became their lives better after the military coups that ousted democratically elected leaders? That could perhaps also be a question asked to them. I think that we should always try to understand that the fight against poverty and the fight for better living conditions and improvements of people's lives has come through democracy, not military coups. You know, when I grew up in the 1980s in Sweden, military coups in Africa was what we knew about Africa. That was the news I wouldn't say every day, but many days of the year. And we left that behind over the last decades and turned to democracy. Not so long ago, the majority of countries in ECOWAS, the Economic Cooperation of Western Africa, were democratic states. Isn't that a good thing? The fact that we, by that, have been able to reduce poverty? It's not the same as to say that everything has been perfect in West Africa or Africa as a whole, but I doubt very much that countries like Russia care very much for the ordinary man or woman in the streets of Niger or Burkina Faso or Mali. And perhaps in the fullness of time, people will feel differently about that. I hope so, and I hope that we, together with partners in Africa, will be able to show the way forward. And that is by cooperation and partnership. And the Nordic 5 foreign ministers have been here to show that we are in solidarity and in partnership with countries in this region, and have been so for decades. My own country, for example, have had good relations with Nigeria, the country where we are now, for 60 years. That's more than half a century.
Minister, has there been any soul-searching on the part of Europe, just taking into account that we are in a world now where countries in Africa have options, right? They can choose the Russians, they can choose the Chinese over the traditional Western partners. There is a sense that you're losing Europe. I mean, you're losing ground in parts of the world like Africa and other countries that form the global South. Have you, as Europeans, done some soul searching about what it is that you could change in your engagement with this part of the world going forward?
Well, first of all, I would like to actually point to some things which remains very steadfast, and that is the fact that many countries in Africa has voted against Russia and against Russia's illegal aggression of Ukraine in the United Nations General Assembly, and have continued to do so. And that shows very clearly that many states in Africa understands what this war is all about. But setting the Russian aggression against Ukraine aside and looking at the broader picture, I agree that Europe has to do more. And this is for this reason also that the Nordic 5 countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway and Iceland, are in favor of free trade agreements. We believe that we should give the opportunity for goods and services coming out of Africa to reach European markets. My own country's prosperity was built by free trade originally. So we are very much aware of what this means. So since you used the word soul searching, I think that we have already searched our souls, at least the Nordic 5s, and we are proponents of this policy within the European Union, those of us who are EU members. And outside of it, we work unanimously within the United Nations for regulations that would endeavor plans to open up the Security Council for African representation, understanding fully well that what has been going on since the Second World War, the strategic architecture underpinning this order, but that has to be reformed. And it is quite a natural thing to talk about states from Africa or Asia with India and Indonesia as good examples, as states who should have, the right to sit at the table. I don't see that as a problem. I doubt very much, though, however, that a country like China see things that way. I don't think that China would like to see India at the table in the Security Council. And I think that we should be open about the fact that China also has ambitions in this regard, which is not about opening up the world for democracy or rights of smaller states. China also have imperial ideas, imperial plans, and they fan out in Asia, where you can find many states who are small, who team up with states in Africa and in EU, who also believe that smaller states have the right not to be trodden on, and the right not to be exposed to imperialistic, outdated ideas.